Lannister. Chapter 61. Overdue Delivery. In the game of stones, you either win or you wait. The more power stones you offer, the faster the chapters come. Acolyte Halline Pav. The pyromancer glanced towards the walls of Lannisport, red with the granite of the Westerland's coast. They looked like toys in the distance compared to the towering bulk of Castley rock around the side of the bay. The mountain was certainly an imposing sight. Covered in windows, battlements, and bastions, it was far larger than any fortress Halline had ever seen. The towering stone edifice utterly dwarfed the Red Keep, the Hightower. He doubted even Harrenhal could possibly compare to the sheer scale of the mountain-made fortress. And here he was making a delivery to one of its masters. It had been some time now since the second son of Lord Tywin Lannister had visited the Pyromancer's Guild of King's Landing. The boy had been mostly Halline's responsibility to track while he had perused the Order's library, gravitating towards treatises on the physical properties of the substance, and on the methods of magic and sorcery now long lost to their order. Halline had caught no small amount of flack from the Wisdoms for allowing an uninitiated noble such access, but they had calmed when he informed them of just how much of the substance the little lion intended to buy. No such large purchases of the substance had been made since the unfortunate death of King Aegon the Unlikely at Summerhall 2 decades ago. That didn't stop the Wisdoms from being annoyed at him, but it had spared him any immediate consequences in favor of being put personally in charge of all matters relating to the Lannister brat. They approved his associate membership, to the extent of letting him read from the guild library, after a careful review to keep the means of creating the substance a secret, and then promptly washed their hands of the affair, leaving the logistics of transporting 100 pots of the substance across the width of the continent to Halline. It was an arduous task, he had soon discovered. No ship was willing to carry the substance so far as Lannisport without a truly enormous cost, well more than Halline could spare. Likewise, no overland caravan company could possibly be trusted not to accidentally ignite the substance and kill themselves in a ball of green fire. Instead, Halline had been forced to organize the entire venture entirely on his own. Hiring independent teamsters and purchasing well-built wagons, he had filled each wagon's base with sand dredged up from the beaches of the Blackwater, which made a very heavy load, needing additional horses. Then he had placed every gallon pot of the substance, particularly the older ones where the liquid had bled into the clay of their containers, into larger open-topped pots filled with wet sand, which were then covered with thick clay lids. Just safely stowing it all had taken nearly a month of very careful work. Then, there was the long drive up the Gold Road from King's Landing overland to Lannisport. Moving carefully, and only by night, they had crossed the great expanse south of the Blackwater between the Crownslands, Stormlands, Riverlands, and Reach. Over vast rolling plains and past the northern edge of the Kingswood, they had traveled and bribed 2 groups of bandits on the way who wanted little to do with the substance at any rate, then into the northern Reach and finally up past Deep Den into the Westerlands. The mountains then had been the worst of the journey, up and down, always cautious to avoid bumping the carts. Sometimes Halline had even needed to go out with the men and level the path, flatten stones, or dislodge them from the road such that the wagons could cross smoothly without too much jostling. Often Halline had feared for his life when they had descended down steep slopes where no such precautions could be managed, but their luck had held true, and he had not been yet added to the long list of alchemists who had died in their own fires. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was really only about 120 miles of mountain road, the Gold Road broke away from the mountains south of the range the Westermen called the Upper Spine. The view from the edge of the mountains was breathtaking as it looked out over endless golden wheat fields, dotted with villages and small towns that stretched across from horizon to horizon and mountain range to mountain range. This great valley leading to the coast was apparently Lannister lands, and as vast as any farmland that Halline had ever seen in the Reach. 1,000,000 men must have lived within the bounds of the valley, and at its northern tip, where the upper spine broke before the ocean, there sat Lannisport and the Rock. Now, finally, at the end of this exhaustive journey, Halline could only smile, as the wagons trundled through the gate of Lannisport, and set out towards the massive gate of the monstrous castle mountain that looked over it. They passed through the Gold Gate in a group, where massive statues of 2 Lannister kings sat looking over the road. Castle Lannister, which sat on a forested hill just inside the walls, looked like a child's toy set against the shadow of the rock, despite being quite large itself. Passing it by, they trundled along through a market square, and then through another set of gates through the old city walls. It was slow going at times, with the crush of thousands of men and wagons, horses, and other livestock all around them, but Halline was comfortable enough in this element, and his teamsters all hailed from King's Landing. In comparison, Lannisport was much more open and less cramped, and like Aldtown, it didn't stink half as badly. Together, his caravan passed before the Gold Star Sept, which was much smaller than the Great Sept of Baelor but had a shining dome covered in gold that reflected the light of the sun. At its foot was the main plaza of the entire city, an enormous granite plinth that stretched southwest from the hill that the Gold Star Sept sat on all the way to the Sunset Sea. Each side of the great plaza was planted with rows of oak trees, and all the major roads of the city fed out onto it. Cutting across it, they left the Gold Road behind and found the route that would take them to the doors of Castle Rock itself. One final gate, this time out of the city walls of Lannisport proper, saw them enter a bailey of sorts for the rock, a walled area before the gates of the Lion's Mouth that seemed to have a bustling new town springing up inside of it. Large furnaces at one side spewed smoke up into the air, and men ran back and forth carrying huge stacks of paper or containers of ink on small hand wagons. A few other businesses were present, all with clean buildings and freshly painted signs. Halline would guess they were no older than a year at most. There was a glassworker's shop and a potter, and a large smithy still under construction. There was the sound of hammering from the shipyards, and everywhere shouting and lively rushing back and forth as if everyone here had something to do. Of course, Halline too had something to do, and he greeted the guards as he approached the Lion's Mouth. Good day, Esser, he waved to the knight in Lannister colors who seemed to be overseeing the wagons moving in and out of the mountain's gate. Most of them were full of paper, it seemed, paper with writing on it. Odd. I'm here with a delivery for the young Lord Callum Lannister. The knight snorted in a distinctly piggish manner, which saw his nostrils flare up. You and everyone else in the Seven Kingdoms, the man grumbled, glancing at Halline up and down. You another banished maester or something. His voice was nasally and thin, despite his stout appearance. Ah, no, not at all. My name is Halline, Acolyte Halline. I'm here to deliver the young lord's purchase from the Alchemist Guild in King's Landing. The knight blinked, then glanced at the wagons behind Halline and paled. Is all of that, he paused. I'll need to inform Sir Kevin before I can allow wildfire into the rock, he said, before turning to one of the halberdiers at his side. You there, man, run up and find Sir Kevin and probably young Lord Callum too, bring both of them down here at once. He turned back to Halline with a glare, and you get those carts down off the bridge this instant. I don't know why you thou. That won't be necessary, Sir Lorch. Halline perked up as he heard a familiar voice. Walking up behind his wagons was the frightening little Lannister boy he had met around a year previous. I did indeed order some 100 jugs of wildfire from the Alchemists Guild. I've had one of the caverns near the inner port prepared for them for some time. He turned to Halline. His hair wasn't quite as long as it was before, but he was still immediately recognizable, especially for the gleam in his emerald eyes. It's good to see you again, Acolyte Halline. I'm surprised you were the one charged with making the delivery. Yes, well, Halline winced, trying to come up with a convincing lie. The guild thought someone of appropriate stature should oversee it, given the scale of the transaction. Well, let's keep a move on then. The substance is more of a danger sitting out here than it will be in the shelves of prepared for it. He turned back to the piggish knight. Step aside, Sir Lorch. The stout man frowned, but then nodded without a further word, stepping back out of the way. I still say it's bad business, my lord. Wildfire has a mind of its own, they say. It's killed more kings than any blade. He rubbed his plate-covered arm worriedly as Halline got the carts moving again. That may be, but properly handled it has use to house Lannister yet. Callum nodded. I've prepared a great deal for its arrival. Once it's stored safely in place, there will be no particular danger to the rock. The knight nodded grimly, and Halline heard no more from him as Callum went with them deeper into the massive stone castle. The interior tunnels on the base level, used to move raw materials, huge amounts of food for the rock's larders, and gold drawn up from the mines below were easily wide enough to accommodate all the wagons and the animals pulling them, and they gradually made their way at a walking pace through the dimly lit channels. Halline could soon hear the sound of the ocean echoing through the tunnels, and they arrived in a huge dank cave, lit only by a couple of windows that must have looked out on the outer surface of the mountain, each covered by heavy iron bars. The ground was wet and everything smelled of the sea. We're near the inner port here, and the seawater pushes up through cracks in the wall there up to about knee height when the tide comes in. Callum gestured towards one of the walls in the dim light. It's cool at all times of year, and this cavern will keep the air good and wet. The shadow of the mountain will also keep direct sunlight from coming in through the windows. It ought to be as safe a place as any to store the substance. Halline nodded. It's well chosen, he mumbled, though, from the manacles hanging on the walls, this chamber had once been used for a much grimmer purpose. I'll have the men start loading the pots onto the shelves. Each of the actual pots of the substance is stored within a larger pot of sand, for safety reasons, but they should be easy enough to access, should you need them. I've also prepared a number of vintages, from freshly made substance to some potted more than 60 years past. He stroked the thin brown hair at his chin. Do you already have the payment prepared? Yes, I have the coinage of course, but I may need a bit longer to arrange a ship back to King's Landing for you unless you intend to return by land. Ah, that would be most appreciated, my lord. Halline nodded, and the 9-year-old smirked back. Well, I'll have that arranged then, and for your wagons also. He chuckled, though, Acolyte Halline, tell me, you are a pyromancer yes, but is your only interest in fire from the substance, or do you have wider horizons? Halline blinked, not sure what the boy was getting at. After a moment of thought, he answered, I suppose that I'd be interested in other forms of flame beyond the conventional, but I've no interest in kitchen fires or the like. Callum Lannister wore an eerie smile as he replied, looking like a cat who'd found a mouse. Well then, Acolyte, I'd like to invite you up to the yard of Castle Rock. His voice was bright with eagerness. I've got a bit of a demonstration scheduled for this evening. Chronicle of the Targaryen dynasty in the Seven Kingdoms. Maester Willem. 277 AC 10th day of 6th moon. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and Lord Steffon Baratheon finally make their return from their harrowing journey across the narrow sea with a new bride for Prince Rhaegar of ancient Valyrian stock, Lady Valia Balea Orios. The lady is tall and slender, with blonde hair, her eyes are like those described by her ancestor Orion Bormaphus, with golden irises and lilac sclera. She brings with her a series of gifts for House Targaryen which she has brought from Volantis, including 100 elephants, 100 tigers, a great golden dramond twice the size of the dramonds in Prince Rhaegar's fleet, and most prominently the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, which was apparently purchased from the Golden Company some decades ago. King Aerys greeted his son and future daughter at the docks and is said to have welcomed both of them with open arms. The marriage is scheduled to take place in the Great Sept of Baelor next month. Also returning with the fleet is a Tyroshi information broker named Varys, whom Prince Rhaegar relied upon to find him proper marriage candidates. For his services, King Aerys promotes him to Master of Whispers. Rumors swirl as well that King Aerys is considering promoting Lord Steffon Baratheon to replace Lord Tywin Lannister as Hand of the King, for his own part in the prince's betrothal. Lannister. Chapter 62. Light up the world. Acolyte Halline Pav. The yard of Castle Rock was comparatively modest, given the sheer size of the castle it resided in. It was probably still large enough to fit another castle within, but not more than a small one, and perhaps at most 2,000 men could stand in it comfortably. It was cut into the top of the lower summit of the mountain, the Lion's Back, in a 20-foot deep pit quarried out of the solid rock, and the sides were reinforced with stone buttresses to ensure it remained open. Stone grates sat in many corners and low places in the yard which funneled rainwater or snowmelt down into the castle's reservoirs, giving it a practical purpose as a giant raincatch. While it was typically, as Halline understood, used for training Lannister knights and squires, and for festivities or the like, tonight it was occupied primarily by a large apparatus which Callum Lannister was futzing with. An apparatus of tubes and copper wires, it stuck out like a sore thumb on the sands, even in the thin light of the crescent moon above. I think we're ready, everything is fixed into place. The boy said quietly, before speaking up. Everyone, I'm glad you've all come up here tonight. I know the stairs are a bit of a pain. Halline wasn't the only one to groan at that, several of the other men and women in the courtyard echoed him. There was quite a motley collection, a summer islander if he wasn't mistaken, a beautiful woman who was unmistakably Licini, the boy's uncle and castellan of the castle, and half a dozen SOC of different sorts. After the groaning was done, Callum chuckled, walking around the device he'd built. Now I'd like to thank everyone for setting aside time to come out here this evening. And special thanks to Maester Eomund and Uncle Kevin for letting me skip out of my lessons a little bit to get this thing finished. He then inclined his head slightly towards the portly SOC man, and of course, I could not have finished it at all without your help Loam. The fat man chuckled good-natured dly, his chins jiggling. Here, on with it then. He grinned broadly. Callum took it in stride, nodding. I suppose I am rather eager to get this underway as well. Any questions you have can wait until after it's started, I'll explain then. The boy grinned, walking to one side of the device and taking hold of a wooden dowel affixed to a lever, like those used to operate winches and castle portcullises. I won't waste any more time with this. Be sure to not look directly at it for too long. With a heave of his shoulder, the boy dragged down the dowel rod, and with a hissing snap the device shuddered, and a flare of light burst forth in a clear glass ball at one end of it. Snapping and crackling, it lit up the entire courtyard with a brilliant white, as if a second moon had plunged down to earth. Halline blinked rapidly, raising his hand in front of his face as the sudden brightness made his eyes sting. What manner of fire? He wondered aloud as he lowered his hand. The gleaming glass sphere burned with an inner radiance more brilliant than any he had seen before. Woof, that's bright, Callum said, grinning beside this wonder of crackling light, holding his hand beside it to shade his face. So what do you all think? He glanced back and forth. It's lighting up the courtyard pretty well, yeah. Is this sorcery? Sir Kevin Lannister asked, though his voice seemed doubtful. Callum, what is it that you have made? Not at all, uncle. Callum seemed eager, his smile enormous cast in the silhouette of the crackling white light. His voice held a joyous, almost manic tone. Not one bit of sorcery, merely applied knowledge. He threw his hand back towards the device eagerly. Halline was still blinking spots from his eyes, but he could see now that it was part of the construct, copper wires feeding from the mess of cylinders into the glass ball. Just as man in ancient days learned to tame fire by means of sticks and stones, I have learned a means to tame lightning by copper and tin and charcoal. The boy sounded proud, and, Halline supposed, he had the right to. The brilliant light within that crackling sphere brought wonder to his heart, though there was fear also. Just like the substance, the alchemist thought, staring at that glowing orb, burning away the night. Dramatics aside, Callum continued. This device is what I am calling a charcoal arc lantern. He said, waving his hand over the ball. A charge of electricity, that is, lightning, is run between two sticks of charcoal, with a separating layer of plaster between them and a connecting bit of charcoal at the tip. The boy tapped his two index fingers together. The charcoal connecting the two rods burns away in an instant, but the lightning continues to arc between the two charcoal rods, slowly burning away at the plaster between them. The light you can see is coming from the arc of lightning between the two bits of charcoal. Halline listened carefully, not quite understanding what he was hearing, despite the simplicity with which the child laid out the concept. Aha, so you have bottled lightning. The Summer Islander said bombastically, a work of true craftsmanship, my friend Loam. He patted the glassmaker on the back. There's nothing special about that glass though. The fat man muttered quietly. It's a good product but nothing out of the ordinary. When you say a charge of lightning is run between two charcoal rods, the Licini woman spoke to Callum, who perked up at the question. How exactly do you make the lightning do so? That is the sorcery here, is it not? Ah, well, that gets down to the nature of electricity. Callum spoke the strange word again. It is more a matter of understanding the properties of physical matter than it is of magic, as Maester Eoman would say. The boy nodded to the old man. There is nothing in this device that could not be replicated by any of you, with no mystical learning or higher knowledge. Halline felt a bit skeptical of that as he tried to avoid staring directly at the enormously bright flame. It was as if Callum Lannister had pocketed the fire of the very sun itself, regardless of whether it was lightning, as he said. He felt questions form in his mind far faster than he could possibly ask them. This was a new wonder. Halline wished desperately to know more. Alas, unfortunately there was still an order to these things, and the Castellan's questions came before his own, pressing as he felt them. That did not answer the question. How does it work? Sir Kevin Lannister asked, walking up to the device. Is it dangerous? Halline held himself back from snorting. Of course, it was dangerous. Could he not see the light it gave off? That fire must be indescribably hot. Hotter than wildfire. Perhaps as hot as dragonflame. Well, you shouldn't touch it. Callum said to his uncle, just as the man seemed about to reach out for the copper wires. You could hurt yourself severely. Lightning can run through your body as easily as it can charcoal. So that's a yes then? Kevin asked, pulling his arm back slowly. Yes. Don't do that. Callum had gone from sounding triumphant to exasperated. The lamp itself is also very hot. It could start a fire if improperly placed, and the fumes from the burning charcoal could be hazardous if used indoors. The child explained. Would you stick your hand into a fireplace to see if it was dangerous, uncle? Lord Kevin chuckled at the analogy, before glancing warily back at the device, shielding his eyes from the light. Are you certain it's not sorcery though? He asked again. I have never heard tell of such a thing, save for the glass candles of Valyria. This is nothing like a glass candle. Callum protested. I don't even need the glass. That's to diffuse the light so that it spreads better. The boy was in it now. Halline could hear the passion in his voice. Like an alchemist speaking about his craft, the passion had taken him. Glass candles use actual magic, probably. They're a lost art from ancient times. This is no such thing. This is something new. Like the press, it's something I invented. He laughed. The only one in the world, but soon there shall be more of them. They're simple things once you understand them. Lord Kevin actually took a step back from the boy, blinking in surprise. Are you all right, Callum? Halline watched as the boy blinked, falling out of his passion visibly, and shaking his head. Ah, I'm sorry, uncle, I think I've just let this project get a bit too much to my head, he said after a moment, Kevin visibly relaxing at his words. Halline just hoped he could get to the actual questions soon, there was so much to learn. I'm a bit invested in it if you can't tell, and I promise you, it's all understanding and engineering, no sorcery at all, no more than there is in a fire pit. The Castellan of the Rock looked like he was about to reply when a childish shriek of glee filled the courtyard rather suddenly, drawing the attention of all. Callem. Halline blinked as a very small, and indeed very ugly child walked out from one of the arches at the side of the courtyard with a limping gait, his hands raised into the air. Callum, you finished it. Halline had heard that Lord Tywin had a dwarf son, but even he couldn't have conceived of a child so ugly within his mind. The boy's face was twisted, his forehead jutted out and one eye was larger than the other. His hair was so silvery as to be white, and his fingers were stubby. Combined with his limp he looked more like a mummer's freak than the son of a lord, but such thoughts were dispelled a moment later as Lord Kevin began to speak. Tyrion boy, you ought to be in bed. The man said good-naturedly, walking forward to scoop his nephew up into his arms. The boy's stunted sighs allowed it easily. Your brother's work is dangerous at any rate. Callum said he'd show me when it was done. Tyrion maintained, and Kevin grumpily looked back at his other nephew, raising his eyebrow. It was certainly a striking figure cast in the blazing white light of the arc lamp. I did, the somewhat older boy acknowledged, scratching the back of his neck. Though I'd planned to do so, you know, in the morning, in my study. That's cheating. Tyrion, for the boy's name was Tyrion, whined in his uncle's arms. Everyone else gets to see. Kevin Lannister sighed as if he had heard this debate before. Very well, I suppose you can look, but don't stare straight at the light. He chided, which prompted a chuckle from Callum in turn. It was all very heartwarming in Halline's opinion, but he wasn't really that interested in the family drama. Instead, he shuffled forward to look at the makings of the device more closely. Pardon me, Milord Callum, but I have some more questions about this device. He gestured his hand towards the collection of cylinders and copper wires that made up the base of the thing. Now that the initial questions of sorcery had been resolved, not that Halline would have minded sorcery one bit, he was full of questions and a need for clarification about this device, how it functioned, and how it lit fire from lightning. I presume that these cylinders, and the wires, serve in some manner to channel the lightning which lights the lamp. Ah. Callum nodded, turning from his uncle and brother to Halline and nodding. Yes, they're a series of voltaic piles. Well, how should I explain this? He tapped his chin. At its core, all of it comes down to generating an electrical charge. Lannister. Chapter 63. In the Office of the Hand. Tywin Lannister Pav. Tywin set down the letter from Kevin in front of him, before glancing over at the one from Callum, scratching at his neck with a frown on his face. If either one of them had sent such news without the other, Tywin would have had difficulty believing it. Both, however. Tywin tugged at his forehead. Callum's printing press was a clever invention and one that had already done great things for Lannister prestige. It was no doubt one of the greatest works of the age. But bottling lightning, using it to create a glass torch that burned as bright as the moon. That was beyond the work of just a clever mind. Callum maintained in his letter that there was no sorcery in it, and had even included a very loose explanation of how it worked in his letter, but Tywin found it hard to believe. Kevin also expressed doubts in his letter. Tywin's brother thought that perhaps Callum had discovered some new form of sorcery without intending to. It was moderately amusing. Many were the men who claimed to wield magic but instead practiced parlor tricks, or claimed to tell fortunes but sold only lies and estimations. Here instead was his son stealing lightning from the heavens and calling it little more than a complex form of blacksmithing. Or rather, it would be amusing if it wasn't his own child getting involved in sorcery. Magic had a poor reputation for a reason after all, no matter whether more respectable sorts like the pyromancers claimed otherwise. Tywin was no expert, but rumors of blood sacrifice and terrible curses were enough to make most men, small folk, and lord alike shun such things. Harmless Callum's work might be for now, but sorcery rarely boded well for its practitioners or those around them. The thought that Callum might be right, and it indeed was not sorcery at all, did not make it less dangerous, not necessarily. Especially with Callum still so young, a fountain of the invention. Tywin needed to slow him down, at any rate, move him back towards safer things, like political treatises, or swordplay. Tywin did let out a low chuckle at that thought. Still, Tywin sighed as he glanced over at Callum's letter once again, at the sketch contained within. A lighthouse stood atop the very peak of the rock, thrice the height of Aldtown's Hightower when factoring in the mountain castle beneath it. It would be built over the existing tower there, and his son's study, and capped with a golden statue, or a gold-plated bronze statue, as his son's notes suggested, of the boy's mother. Tywin's fingers crinkled the paper at the edges of the drawing, he didn't remember when he had picked it up. The idea of it stirred his heart, the potential of his son's device, sorceress or not, to blaze through day and night as a tribute to Tywin's lost love. No one would accuse Tywin Lannister of being a romantic man, but such a gesture was appealing to even his cold heart. He tugged at his eyes gently. That boy is unreasonable with this. How can I deny it? He knew that of all his children, Callum had been the closest to Joanna, and ultimately, closest to Tywin as well. He appreciated Callum's letters, as he was sure the boy himself had noticed. His mind cycles through pragmatic excuses. Lighthouses did have a practical purpose after all, and it would certainly be an ostentatious display of House Lannister's wealth and power. Tywin grumbled to himself and began to write. One letter to Kevin, and one to Callum. It didn't matter how intelligent his second son was, or how much he liked his ideas. The boy needed to slow down, he was pursuing too many things at once, and with such activity came risks. One need only look at King Aerys to see how a man with good ideas could fit between them like a mayfly and never get anything properly done. Now, Callum had probably already achieved more than Aerys ever would in his life, but that was beside the point. Tywin wrote his orders clearly. Callum would be allowed to continue his ongoing projects, the little citadel he was building, the printing of the seven-pointed star, and this lighthouse for Joanna, but no more than that. Once the lighthouse was completed, which should not take more than a year, Callum would be squired and sent off somewhere to hopefully slow his charge a bit and give the boy time to grow up. That was the best solution at the moment. If Tywin let him squire for Esser Ilyn or Kevin, or some other household knight at the Rock, he suspected the boy would continue on much as he already was. Tywin frowned for a moment, considering where exactly the boy should go. He had put a great deal of thought already into where Jaime ought to end up, but not a great deal towards his precocious second child. It ought to be in the Westerlands, someone under Tywin's control, lest his son be put to work making presses or something instead of properly squired, perhaps Lord Crakehell or. The hand of the king blinked, as a thought arose, and he had his answer. Callum was immensely talented and intelligent but lacked martial rigor, so who better to squire for than Tygett? The man was on the north coast, far from the boy's multitudinous projects in Lannisport, and Callum could stand to be bloodied a little against the Ironborn, fishermen, that were pestering Tywin's subjects. While the bloody marauders were fearsome on the sea, Tygett would be more than capable of keeping Callum safe while their feet were on the ground. The Ironborn were never any good against cavalry, and Tygett was a masterful rider and a born knight. As he finished scribbling out his orders, including a short explanation of his reasoning for Callum, he went to reach for another parchment, only to be stopped by a knock at the door. Tywin glanced out the balcony window to the moon rising high over the Blackwater Bay. It had better not be something frivolous to bother him at this hour. Who is it? He asked curtly, raising his voice. Me, father. Cersei's voice came from the door, and Tywin let the tension lessen somewhat from his shoulders. Not a scheming courtier pestering him over something or other then, just his daughter coming to visit him in the office. He supposed he had missed dinner. Come in, Tywin said, leaning back in his chair a bit. Have you eaten? He asked as she opened the door. Cersei was growing quickly these days into a beautiful young woman, shooting up like a beansprout when he wasn't looking, her chest had even started to develop a bit. That was honestly concerning. Tywin was hoping to go a few more years before he had to start rendering courtiers into eunuchs. Since Rhaegar was getting married, it wasn't even useful on that front. Cersei was hardly going to have a chance to catch the babe Prince Viserys' eye for many years yet. Thankfully, for now, she was a bit gangly and awkward, unused to her growing height, but Tywin could see his daughter would grow beautiful, and that would no doubt be a blessing and a curse. I haven't, Cersei said, shaking her head. Father, I've come to discuss something important with you, she said quickly, and Tywin raised an eyebrow. Her voice was a bit ragged, so perhaps she had been crying. Of course, in the time he had known his daughter, that only gave it roughly even odds of being serious or frivolous. At any rate, she needed to be calmed down before she'd speak sense. We will discuss it after the servants bring something up from the kitchens. I haven't eaten either. Tywin rang the small silver bell on his desk and quickly barked an order that had the maid who answered running to the kitchens to fetch whatever they had hot and ready to eat. Father, the girl pressed to continue, but Tywin wasn't having it. She needed to take a moment to breathe or she'd just go on and on without thinking. Cersei was fine enough when she stopped to think. She could even be clever at times, unlike most women, but she needed to learn to pause and consider, to think about her position and get out of her own head. Tywin raised his finger. We will speak while we eat, he said sternly, before allowing his expression to soften minutely. You must learn to be more patient, Cersei. I've spoken to you often about this. The wind seemed to fall from Cersei's sails. Yes, father, I'm sorry. Tywin nodded calmly, accepting her apology. Tywin nodded slowly, before glancing away from her, down at his desk, where he had just finished writing out letters for Kevin and Callum. Cersei seemed to notice his gaze and glanced down at them curiously. Oh, she said, suddenly regaining her energy. Are you writing to Callum? And your uncle Kevin? Yes. Tywin mulled over whether he ought to tell Cersei about Callum's latest project. Deciding she'd hear about it anyway in time, he bobbed his head lightly. Your brother has discovered a means by which to bottle lightning, and use it as a torch. Cersei blinked, staring straight into Tywin's eyes with clear surprise. Is that, father, is that a thing which can be done? Kevin attests that he's done so, and Callum's included a drawing of the device as well. Tywin offered the letter Callum had sent to Cersei, along with the sketches of the arc lamp and the lighthouse. Cersei scanned the letter quickly. Under her breath Tywin heard her mumble something about how pretty her brother's handwriting was before she gasped suddenly. I remember these. Lannister. Chapter 64. Secrets Between the Walls. Tywin Lannister Pav. Cersei scanned the letter quickly. Under her breath Tywin heard her mumble something about how pretty her brother's handwriting was before she gasped suddenly. I remember these. Tywin blinked at the outburst, craning forward over his desk to look at what Cersei was shouting about. Obliging him, the girl put the drawing of the arc lamp down. These are the Voltic, they're the stacks of discs he's had in his study since forever. I always wondered what they were for. She twirled her hair around her fingers slightly as she looked over the notes. He talked about it a few times. I didn't realize. Cersei began to murmur to herself lightly as Tywin looked at her. She seemed to be racking her brain about something. Callum is very clever. She finally seemed to decide. I think he's known how to bottle lightning for a long time, if the notes here are telling the truth, and Callum wouldn't lie. Tywin scratched his cheek as Cersei spoke, considering the new information. Speaking honestly, he had only actually visited Callum's study once to see the view. The climb up the stairs to the top of the rock took far too long to make regular trips, especially with Callum away from the rock in Dorne when Tywin had last visited his home. Are there any other projects Callum was working on when you last visited his workshop? Tywin would like to be aware of them in advance, if possible. Well, when last he had the things. She pointed at the drawing of the stacked discs. He mentioned something about a noise maker. I wasn't paying attention. Cersei scratched the back of her head, blushing slightly. Tywin frowned in thought for a moment. Perhaps he's figured out how to make lightning, but not yet thunder. He posited. The two were related, so he supposed if you could bottle one then you could bottle the other. He wasn't entirely sure what thunder would be useful for though. He supposed he could add a question about that to his letter. A heady scent filled the room as mutton spiced with rosemary was carried in on a platter for them to have, along with cups of watered-down wine to accompany their dinner. Tywin nodded to the servants, then waved them out, glancing back over to Cersei, who now seemed to have turned her attention to the other drawing. Oh, she commented, a content smile on her face. Callum, he's really a lot like mother. Tywin felt his heart warm as he saw his daughter's expression, and he reached out, placing his arm on her shoulder. He really is. He chuckles lightly. She was clever too, though in a less dramatic way. Joanna had at times maneuvered Tywin into doing things he didn't actually want to do, without upsetting him in the process. That required quite a bit of cleverness, though perhaps not of the same sort Callum had. Cersei seemed to smile at that. Of course. He takes after her in everything. His daughter brightened up considerably. Just like I take after you, father. Cersei declared proudly, standing to her full, growing height as she looked up to meet his gaze with her emerald eyes. Tywin was a bit taken aback by the outspoken declaration and nearly snorted. Nearly. Instead, he let himself relax slowly. Cersei, well, he supposed she did take after him in some ways. She certainly had the proper attitude towards those who insulted her house, and there was a viciousness there she had yet to refine. There was no argument that part of his seed wasn't strong in her. Still, he doubted anyone would mistake her for him the way they might mistake Callum for Joanna. It just wasn't worth correcting her on that, so he chose to change the subject. So, Cersei, our dinner is here, what is it you actually came here to speak to me about? Ah. Cersei stopped preening and shook her head, glancing towards the door, and, seeing it shut, turning back to him, her voice dropped to a whisper. Yes, I shan't forget it. Father. That Volantin woman, Valia. I saw her doing blood magic in the black cells. She is a sorceress. It was several months ago that Cersei had discovered a little passageway when she had been kicking around in a bout of frustration. She had been forced to attend to sewing and embroidery and other ladylike things she was quite displeased with, and in anger, she punched the wall of her room. The blow knocked loose a wooden panel. Behind it, she found an entrance into an old dusty passage. The floor was thick with dust, and the air stale and ancient. The inside of it was illuminated only by a few peepholes that filtered in light from the surrounding rooms, squirreled away near the floorboards, or built cleverly into old furniture. Now, any normal, cowardly 11-year-old girl would have shrieked and run to her father and had it sealed up. After all, some villain might come and molest her in the night like Lan the Clever had done to the Castley daughters. But Cersei saw herself more as Lan himself than as one of those helpless girls, and so, armed with a dagger she stole from the kitchens, Cersei Lannister snuck into the old passage with excitement and adventure in her heart. The dust and the grime didn't bother her at all, though she did have to change her clothes more often and hide the dust as best she could from the washerwoman. The tunnels were actually a little less cramped than the similar passages of Castley Rock, and far less extensive. She soon found a sealed dark room with a dragon mosaic on one wall that looked like no one had visited it for 100 years. From there passages went off all under Aegon's High Hill and across the Red Keep. They snaked between cells in the dungeons, up into the Maiden Vault, and around beneath the Godswood. Covered in dust and the grime of ages, the only place they never took Cersei was Maegor's Holdfast. Untouched for decades, she saw not another soul in those tunnels as she explored as she pleased, a secret adventure hidden away from all the foolish people as she eavesdropped or spied on them through hidden peepholes. In the dark of the night or in the early morning, when no one would think to check on her in her chambers and her father wouldn't have some night or other following her about, she would slip into those uncomfortable passages and be transformed. Like her dream as a child, here she was, Lan the Clever, sneaking into Castley Rock through the mines, stealing their secrets and fucking their daughters under their noses. Well, not that last part, but she had certainly seen more than enough of that in the last few months, married and unmarried couples, illicit affairs, and even sword swallowers. There were 10,000 little nooks and crannies in the Red Keep where they snuck away out of sight, but Cersei saw them all, or at least a good number of them. She had never known people did so much of that. It was thrilling in a way she didn't quite understand, and it put vivid thoughts through her pubescent imagination. It was not all she spied through the peepholes in the tunnels though, not all that she heard through the walls either. Little plots of silly courtiers, duels in the evening fires of the great yard. Cersei saw it all from her hideaway, thrilled each time that she alone was clever enough to spy on them. No one expected little Cersei, rebellious Cersei, could be watching them in their most private moments and discreet meetings. It made her smile just thinking about it. Even more so when she saw the same courtiers, servants, and nobles in the halls of the Red Keep. She laughed within her mind, because she knew their secrets and they had no idea. That love of adventure and spying on the unknowing fools was what led her to tonight, crouching in the tunnels of the Maiden Vault to peep out at the Volantine woman and her barbarous entourage. Cersei Lannister did not like the Volantine woman. She did not like the way she entered the city with a huge parade, full of marching elephants and tigers in cages, or the way that the people cheered for her when she did. She did not like that the woman's huge household had taken up a massive portion of the Red Keep, with SOC servants rushing about everywhere, and she did not like that the woman went about like she was already the queen, hardly deigning to look at anyone save Prince Rhaegar and the king. No, Cersei didn't like that one bit. Lannister. Chapter 65. Secrets Between the Walls 2. Cersei Lannister Pav. She did not like that the woman's huge household had taken up a massive portion of the Red Keep, with SOC servants rushing about everywhere, and she did not like that the woman went about like she was already the queen, hardly deigning to look at anyone save Prince Rhaegar and the king. No, Cersei didn't like that one bit. It didn't help that the woman was prettier than her either, just for now, she told herself, she'd grow up to be prettier still, or that she was able to carry a spear around and no one dared insult her to her face about it. Oh, some of them whispered behind the Volantine woman's back of course, but even then, Cersei knew that they were far more accepting of it from Lady Valia than they would ever be if Cersei took up a sword publicly. Likewise for her two bodyguards, the women who stood near the height of Lord Baratheon and rippled with muscle, from some strange SOC kingdom far east of even Volantis. They had been mocked at first, for being warrior women and for their strangely accented High Valyrian. It was probably good that they didn't speak the common tongue. But that mockery and quieted significantly since the red-haired one had sparred with Ser Barristan of the King's Guard in the great courtyard. The middle-aged knight had still won in the end, but it had been a closer thing, and many of the lords who had been so eager to wag their tongues before now kept such mockery to themselves. Cersei wanted that. She wanted to be so powerful, so beautiful, and so strong and skilled that no one would ever dare to criticize her again, that any fool who thought to insult her in even the slightest of ways was laughed out of court, mocked, and died in ignominy and disgrace. That some SOC woman was closer to that perfect dream than she was rankled her. Now she spied on Lady Valia from a mousel beneath a cupboard in her quarters, listening carefully and hiding her breathing with her hand. She could see the Volantine woman's bare feet, pale and thin, as she sat in her chair. Occasionally clumps of silvery blonde hair were falling to the ground, as a servant, barefoot also, was giving the future queen a haircut. How exactly does your cousin expect me to give him such authority? Discreetly Lyria. The powerful voice of the dragon-blooded woman sounded frustrated. I doubt it would go over well politically. I do not want to repeat the mess that made me leave Volantis in the first place. It's not, he doesn't wish for it to be a public affair at all, my lady, only that once you are married to Prince Rhaegar and secure in your own position, you bribe some gold cloaks, make them look the other way at a few disappearances. The servant, so named Lyria, said quietly. He only needs a few to start, and it's not as if anyone cares if they disappear. He should be happy enough that I'll hold to the deal he made on your behalf. Lady Valia grumbled. It is no small thing to share. I am certainly very thankful for that, my lady. You should be, it is no small ask, but a deal is a deal, and I suppose he did get me out of Volantis with most of my wealth intact, Valia said dryly. Tell him I will consider it, next time you speak to him. As you will, my lady, Lyria said graciously. Would you like to see the back now? Yes, show me in the mirror. Cersei heard something clanking as she listened with interest. It seemed this servant woman, Lyria, was more than just a base maid, that and Lady Valia had apparently fled Volantis, not simply left to marry Prince Rhaegar. She pressed her eye eagerly against the peephole. Good job, Lyria, Valia said approvingly. Now gather up the hair. I'll need it for the blessing later. Of course, my lady. Cersei saw small, pale hands begin to pick up the hair from the floor, scooping it up into a little leather satchel. Do you intend to do it here? Oh, no, they'll mind the blood. It was enough work cleaning it up the first time. Valia answered without missing a beat. No, such things are better done in dark places anyway. Ulka has confirmed for me that no one will be in the palace dungeons tonight, and no one will mind the blood there. Cersei gasped. What sort of blessing would leave the floor bloody? She realized her mistake a moment later, as the sound had slipped out of her without thinking. Did you hear that? Valia asked, stilling in her seat. Cersei saw the muscles in her heels tighten. As panic raced up her spine though, Lyria answered in the negative. Oh, that's just the wind through the rafters. These Westerosi palaces are drafty, at times they even sound like moans. TCH, a savage kingdom truly. Valia groused. Very well, I think it's about time. Do you wish to accompany me for the blessing? I think I shall have to miss it tonight, my lady. Best I go speak to my cousin. He's a bad influence on you. Valia teased, before moving towards the door. Ulka, she thumped her hand on the frame. Ulka, I'll need a ride to the Black Cells. Cersei frowned as the woman left the room. On the one hand, she'd already heard a lot here, but on the other, she knew exactly which tunnel went to the dungeons. It didn't take long for curiosity to win out, and Cersei hurried through the cramped tunnels as she rushed along through the dust and cobwebs, batting them aside with her hand as if they weren't even there. The space was small, cramped, and more than a little bit dank as she worked her way down to the castle dungeons, far away from the maiden vault which lay next to the godswood. The smell was thick and unpleasant as she passed lower and lower down the side of the hill, reaching the split in the tunnels that led to the various levels of the dungeons. Turning to her left, she shuffled down row-hewn steps, her heart pounding in her ears. The tunnel through the black cells had a low ceiling and ran above and between each of the cells, where their ceilings narrowed. Because of the high position of the peepholes, which were much smaller here and only built where certain bricks joined together, Cersei had an excellent view of the ritual Lady Valia was already constructing in these pits. The blonde Volantine stood with her red-haired bodyguard, Urga by her side, a bowl held in her hands, full of her own trimmed hair from earlier. As Cersei arrived, she had clearly already finished some preparations. Valia stood in the center of a ring of 14 circles, holding the bowl against her stomach. Cersei listened closely as she began to speak. 14 gods for 14 flames, hear the prayer of I, your blooded child, and turn your eyes to my hands as I make this offering. A sort of supernatural stillness seemed to settle over the room as she spoke, and Cersei shuddered without knowing why. 14 gods for 14 flames, hear the words of I, your daughter. The woman continued in Valyrian, raising the bowl of hair. See now I bring you the flesh of a dragon, a sacrifice made on your altar of blood and fire. Valia reached out and took Ulka's hand, and the massive warrior woman at once took her knife and sliced her own palm. The wound quickly began to bleed, dripping into the bowl Lady Valia held out. Blood splattered too on the dark floor of the black cells, but Ulka didn't seem to mind, simply bandaging her hand quietly as Valia continued the ritual. Blood of heroes freely shed, flesh of dragon freely given, take this daughter's sacrifice, Balerian cloak of wonder, bring forth new life in me Vagar of ash and soot. Shed your brilliant golden wings Merix's sky tower. And restore my beauty Slahadaran gem-laden. Valia's voice reached a fever pitch now, and Cersei could only watch transfixed as she continued to work her dark magic. Bless me now O gods of my ancestors, light me with your flame anew. There was a sudden screeching, like nails on a chalkboard, and the hair and blood burst into fire, and no ordinary fire at that, it was red as rubies and darker than a smith's flames. It flashed across Valia's body and her bodyguards, driven by the sound of a steady heartbeat. When the fire gradually faded from sight, Cersei could only tell that Lady Valia looked somewhat paler than before. An almost supernatural glimmer to her skin, her eyes glowing with golden light. And that was about all that Cersei saw because no more than 2 seconds had passed before she was up again in the cramped tunnels and running now to her father's office. Her blood thundered in her ears. Lady Valia was a sorceress. And a frightening one at that. Lannister. Chapter 66. Rising Spirits. Kevan Lannister Pav. Kevan chuckled slightly as he saw the servants rushing down the hall, stopping to let them pass despite the fact that he was, technically, acting Lord of Castle Rock. They were carrying what looked like an awful lot of paper after all. Kevan sighed and rubbed at his eyes. Whatever you intended Tywin, I doubt it was this. Things had been hectic at Castle Rock recently, with Jaime going off to the Reach. Kevan had hoped it would quiet down, but far from it. His lord brother has inadvertently dumped a great heap of work on him as usual, though this time entirely by accident. It was actually quite simple. Tywin had told Callum that he had roughly a year to finish up his existing projects before he was sent off to Squire for Tygott on the north coast. From what little explanation Tywin had sent in his letter home, this was intended to slow Callum down a bit and to encourage him to finish the projects he'd already started. What Tywin had probably not expected was that rather than convince Callum to slow down, it had seemingly lit a fire under his ass. Kevan had never seen Callum working so hard. The boy had always been of a somewhat relaxed character despite his blessings. Certainly, he was excited in arguments, or when he wanted to show off a new creation, as with his arc lamps, but most of the time he just seemed to like hiding away in his tower and working on whatever took his fancy. To Kevin's knowledge, the only reason Callum had set foot in his tower all week was to drag things down out of it. Practically the minute he'd gotten the letter back from Tywin, the boy had sequestered himself in a parlor with his retinue of artisans and then come to Kevan with a list of rooms he wanted to requisition in the rock. Resources he needed, and the money to hire laborers, hundreds of laborers. He had presented a great list, and a notional plan of action, and a dozen other things besides. He needed goldsmiths and bronze workers, and regular blacksmiths and makers of cast iron pots and pans. He needed men who could carry heavy loads and men who could work ropes under torsion. He wanted a survey done on the side of Castle Rock, and another on its summit. He wanted architects and castle builders and men who had been inside the Titan of Bravos. Kevin, understandably, did not feel entirely comfortable in his role as Castellan approving all of those expenses. He had written a letter with a summary of them and sent it to Tywin by Raven. When it returned from King's Landing, it contained only one line of text. Spare no reasonable expense for the construction of the statue of Joanna. Kevin had thought long and hard on that phrasing, and come to the conclusion that what his brother probably wanted was for Kevin to just approve whatever Callum asked for. Then when the cost inevitably went far, far over what anyone could possibly predict, Tywin would give Kevin a bit of hell for it and then leave it at that. The total cost of the printing presses, when one factored in all the paper mills, ink production, raw material costs, workers, buildings, and all was already set to cost House Lannister some 250,000 gold dragons over a period of 3 years. This statue and lighthouse that Callum and Tywin wanted to build of Joanna would probably cost more if Kevin had the right of it. Kevin didn't even want to think about what the total cost might be when it was all said and done. So, to minimize the amount of shit he would take from Tywin for the inevitable expense they would incur by giving the little smith-made flesh access to the treasuries of House Lannister, Kevin was doing a very careful job of tracking the reasoning for each and every expenditure. If Callum wanted money for something, he had to come visit Kevin, explain his reasoning and the expected costs, and then Kevin would write it up and store it. It was a system the boy himself had suggested, and it was the only thing helping Kevin sleep better at night as the plans for what was becoming a monumental project were developing. Uncle. Kevin blinked out of his musings as the source of his recent troubles, young Callum, came bounding up to him, for once not carrying a bundle of drawings with him, but instead grinning ear to ear and still full of that manic energy that had possessed him of late. What's got you riled up? Kevin asked, glancing down. The boy's hair was getting longer again, so he was probably going to cut it soon. Callum was rather touchy about his more feminine appearance since he'd returned from Dorne. Kevin supposed the declaration that Callum had been blessed by the maiden would put any self-respecting man or boy on edge. Is something going on? Yes. Callum said, burbling with excitement. You've got to come to the southern balcony, now. We've finished the lift. The boy bounced on his heels a bit, clearly overeager to display his latest miracle. Kevin had gotten to know his personality more in these last few weeks than he had in his entire life before now. At dinner, Callum had always been a quiet, proper, well-behaved child who seemed to take after Tywin in his seriousness and his inclination towards politics. Now though, with his band of artisans at his beck and call, and with funding to actually achieve his desires, Callum had opened up his study's doors like a sluice gate on a river and let the ideas pour out. Kevin hurried along behind as the boy tugged him forward excitedly to one of the many balconies and overlooks on the southern side of Castle Rock, where he could look out and see the heavy iron chains and steep wooden ramps linking a number of landings up the mountain's side from around the base of the Lion's Mouth all the way up to its back, where the courtyard sat amongst a few other structures. Here, Kevin blinked as his nephew shoved something into his hands. Glancing down, he saw that it was an odd device, some sort of far eye, with two brass tubes connected on a hinge. Those are binoculars, hold them to both your eyes instead of just one. Kevin paused, then lifted the device up to his eyes, futzing with the brass latch that held the two ferrayas together. He looked down the mountainside towards the landings with the changes between them. So they're going to carry a few crates up from the bottom of Castle Rock to the top. Kevin knew what the lift was intended to do. Callum had explained it when he'd wanted funding for the massive wrought iron chains that were intended to drive it, not to mention the labor of installing the ramps and leveling the platforms, but actually having it done was a considerable boon. There was a large series of ramps dug into Castle Rock long ago that allowed horse-drawn wagons to make the trip from the Lion's Mouth up to the living quarters. They had been built long ago to bring gold out of the castle and food and firewood into it, but the process took some 7 hours as the horses couldn't climb stairs and the ramps had to be shallow. The lift could, theoretically, take materials up to the Lion's Back in only half an hour or so. They should be starting at the bottom in a few minutes, down by the type foundry. Callum directed, and it took Kevin a moment to find what he was talking about. Down at the very bottom of the mountain, men were loading a few boxes onto a large wooden platform. Ah, looks like they're ready to go now. Where's that flag? Callum asked, and Kevin glanced away from his binoculars to see his nephew searching around for his signal flag, before finding it tucked against the edge of the balcony. Raising the bright white and blue colored ribbon, the boy held it up and waved it back and forth. Glancing down once again, Kevin saw that the message had been received on the ground level, and in the distance, the heavy iron chains began to move. Slowly, gradually, the wooden platform began to rise up the steep incline on its wheels, carried up the mountainside by the chains. Meanwhile, a second wooden platform, which had been sitting at the top of the ramp, began to descend down the mountainside at the same pace. Is there a reason they're both moving at once? Kevin asked idly as he looked at the arrangement. Yes, both platforms are on the same chain, which is hooked around a capstan driven by a team of horses at the top end. They pull the chain, but the other platform acts as a counterweight, like on a trebuchet. That helps reduce the weight the horses need to pull considerably, and when the time comes to raise the other platform, the one they've just raised now will be the counterweight. It took a few minutes for the platform to reach the top of its ramp, and Kevin watched as it was locked in place by more chains before the wooden crates that were being sent up the mountain were taken from it and carried over to the next platform for the next lift. Glancing up the mountainside with his binoculars, Kevin counted 6 such landings to reach the lion's back. It's a clever thing, he admitted, reaching over to pat Callum on his head. This will help House Lannister even after the statue of your mother is finished. Already Kevin could see the utility of such a thing. There was still gold mining on the north side and lower levels of Castle Rock. The lift would let them lower the materials to ground level. That's the idea. Callum pointed down below them to where the forest between the bay and the foot of Castle Rock was being rapidly cut away and new buildings were being raised. The new ironworks will also be useful long afterward, so will the lighthouse itself, the new docks, the communities of craftsmen, merchants, and the like. They'll all be drawn here, and each of them will make us stronger. Callum said eagerly. By the time I come back a night, by then, Callum trailed off, and Kevin glanced over at the boy's expression, which had suddenly grown a bit melancholy. Is something wrong, Callum? Kevin asked. It wasn't usual to see the boy glum, especially with the drive that had filled him recently. Even before that, melancholy was not a typical emotion for Callum. Not since he stopped mourning his mother at least. Callum blinked, then glanced up at him, his cheeks coloring a bit. No, sorry, it's just that, well, I just realized that by the time I return to Castle Rock, we might be, he cut himself off sharply. Sorry, that is, I meant to say it'll probably be around the time I'm to marry Princess Elia. Are you not looking forward to that, Callum? Kevin teased, trying to lift his nephew's mood. He could well understand the fright of leaving home for a long time to Squire. When he had gone off to fight the Ninnepenny Kings, Kevin had been sure that he would never come back. Callum wasn't going to war, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be scared of leaving. Best to take his mind off of it. Princess Elia is quite beautiful, you know. I'm sure you'll feel quite happy with it in a few years. Kevin grinned and patted his head. Well, then again, she hasn't been blessed with beauty by the maiden, so maybe you're setting your standards too high. Oh God, Uncle, stop. Callum threw off his hand. It's bad enough that I hear about it every time I talk to a Septon. The boy groaned in annoyance, and Kevin smiled. It was yet another sign of Callum coming out of his shell since his trip to Dornay. The little perfectly behaved recluse that he remembered never would have expressed his annoyance so openly. Of course, being his uncle, Kevin had no problem with annoying him whatsoever. I suppose you're so offended by it that you're letting your hair grow out again? Kevin asked, giving the boy a grin that made his playful intention clear. No, that's not. Well, that's for the statue, that doesn't count. You're growing your hair out to your father's style again for the statue? Kevin asked. How does that work? To my mother's. The boy shook his head. Pella is going to sculpt my face and use it for a reference since everyone says I look like mother, Callum replied quietly. Kevin could barely hear the end of his words over the wind on the heights. I thank the 7 that Aunt Jenna volunteered to model the body. Kevin snorted, then chuckled, then laughed cheerfully as he reached over and rubbed the boy's head. Truly, Callum was a dutiful son. Kevin was still laughing when dust began to rise on the face of the rock, as at the second section of the lift from the top, something broke and both platforms went hurtling down to the level below them with a crash. Callum, now released from his suddenly silent uncle's grip, rushed to the edge of the balcony to look with his own binoculars, cursing. Damn, chain must have snapped. I've got to get over there and check the damage. It was remarkable how quickly he turned from an embarrassed or melancholy young boy back to the tiny taskmaster who had some 300 servants rushing about to see his vision done. Damn it, damn it, damn it. And that should have been well under the weight thresholds, must have been a weakness in the chain. Callum stormed off back into the rock, no doubt rushing to go address the breakage in his most recent world-changing project. Kevin was left watching him go, wondering just what went through that little head of his. Whatever it was, the Seven had probably put it there, in Kevin's estimation, and that meant it probably wasn't his business. Lannister. Chapter 67. Angst and Anger I. Cersei Lannister Pav. Cersei was upset with her father. Well, it wasn't that she was truly angry. Part of her had always known that her access to the secret tunnels was never going to last forever, but while she tried to hide just how she'd gotten to the black cells from her father, he had figured it out fast enough. He was smart like that, smart the same way she was, not like the fools whom she had spied on. Of course, because he was smart like that, he was never going to let his daughter keep staying in a bedroom with a secret passage that led all over the castle. Instead, after having a pair of Lannister men survey the tunnels, he had ordered the ones in the Tower of the Hand to be quietly sealed up with bricks at the bottom, then filled in with gravel at night. Cersei had been moved to a different chamber at any rate, her one source of freedom in the whole Red Keep cut off from her. On an intellectual level, she knew why her father had done it. She wasn't stupid. She knew that she would do the same if someone had a tunnel into Callum's room that they might use to sneak in and hurt him. And father didn't understand her heart. Of course, he didn't, but that didn't stop it from filling with bitterness at having her soul escape from the drudgery of embroidery circles and gossip stolen away from her. The one source of real adventure in her life was snatched away from her just because she'd done the right thing, just because she'd been a good daughter and come to tell her father about the bitch of a sorceress who worked blood magic in the black cells. The bitch of a sorceress who was busy preparing to marry the man that she was supposed to marry, the prince who was supposed to make her a queen. Cersei ground her face into her pillow as she felt hot tears trickle down her pale cheeks. She didn't want to be trapped in this stupid place any longer if all it meant was futzing about the court with fools and idiots. She didn't want to look at the courtiers who tutted at her about being a proper lady while they sipped their wine, even though Cersei had seen them fucking one of the gold cloaks behind the buttresses at the edge of the great yard. It wasn't that she hated them for being hypocrites, she had always known most people were fools, women most of all. No, it was that she, Cersei, who ought to be going off and doing better things, who by all rights of heart and soul ought to be sparring with Jaime or riding horses or hunting or doing all the other things boys got to do, was stuck in a room eating lumps of cheese on bread and listening to their worthless chastisement. Their words were as sugary as their sliced fruits and as hollow as the walls from which she'd spied their hypocrisy. All of that upset her, but the real reason she was mad at her father was different. The real reason she was mad was that, though she'd come to him and told him the truth and lost her freedom for it, father chose to do nothing about the stupid witch. Oh, he'd heard her out, told her to describe everything in detail, written it down even. Then he'd just told her to not speak of it again. Told her there was nothing that House Lannister could do with the information that would benefit it. Told her that she'd just risked everything, thrown away her one source of adventure and freedom for the sake of a few placating words and nothing more. The witch would still marry Prince Rhaegar, even though she was sure to twist his mind with blood magic like Lara of Lee had bewitched Prince Viserys a century ago. Her father did not see the danger, he thought it was just some SOC nonsense, but he was not a woman, so of course he did not see how evil she could be. Cersei could see though, she could see through Lady Valia just like she had seen through Princess Elia of Dorne who had insulted and berated poor Callum. Lady Valia was a viper and a whore who had used Prince Rhaegar to escape from her sins in Volantis no doubt. She would probably use Prince Rhaegar to take the throne as queen, then poison him to death and rule as regent as soon as they had a son. Cersei had thought of doing that, a few times, so she had no doubt that some sorceress foreign witch would leap at the opportunity. Yet her father could not see, would not see. Only Cersei could see because she had a woman's body and a man's mind. Only she could pierce the veil of deception that the vile woman had thrown up around herself with her lavish gifts to the court. She was angry with her father because no matter how plainly she stated her reasoning, he didn't seem to accept her words as such. He just told her again that there was no useful way to use her knowledge, no way to bring Lady Valia down for being a blood mage. That was why she was angry. Cersei squeezed her pillow tightly as she cried, her breath ragged. Why didn't he trust her? Why wouldn't her father listen to her when she was his oldest child? When she was clever and smart and brave? Why did he look down on her like she was just another foolish woman when she had the heart of a man? Cersei rolled onto her back as the tears rolled down her cheeks, looking at the roof of her bed. She hated this room. She hated this bed. She hated that she'd been moved here, that she was stuck where she didn't want to be, being looked down on even when she was right about everything. Everyone looked down on her these days, everyone in the Red Keep, in King's Landing. Everyone thought she wasn't good enough, from King Aerys himself all the way down to the squires and maidservants who rolled around in the stables when they thought nobody was looking. There wasn't a single person worth respecting in the Red Keep except her father, and she was angry with him. Cersei sniffled and wiped her sleeve across her nose. She missed her brothers, well, not Tyrion obviously, but the twisted infant could barely be called her brother. No, she missed Jaime and Callum. Jaime her perfect equal in every way save his gender. She knew everything about him, for he shared it with her just as she did with him, and he would never, could never look down on her, because they knew each other as well as anyone else in the world. She just wanted to hug him now, to tell him what she had done and seen and learned. She wanted to tell him about the sorceress so that they could plot together, to work to stop the evil woman together and be the heroes of the kingdom. Callum, her beautiful mystery. He was so private and quiet and proper, whereas she and Jaime had always been loud and adventurous. Callum's heart was hidden away like a flower in winter, fragile and tender. He took after mother in mind and body. Cersei had been so distraught when he had been stolen away at the king's tourney. Then as now, father had been unable to see the wicked wiles of Princess Elia sinking her claws into innocent Callum. Cersei had more than once thought of stealing a horse and riding to his rescue, but he had escaped on his own before she found the nerve. She felt her tears subside a bit as she remembered how father had reacted to the news that Callum had been blessed by the maiden in the crone. He had groaned and grumbled, and scheduled a meeting with the High Septon, and started figuring out how much he'd need to bribe the High Septon to get this all resolved. Cersei had been in his office when it happened, having managed to avoid a social event by feigning a headache. While she clutched a rag to her forehead though, she had smiled for hours. She had been right about Callum. Even the most devout could see it. And that meant she was right about herself too. If Callum was blessed by the maiden and the crone, perhaps she was blessed by the warrior and the father. Surely the seven wouldn't just bless her brother and leave her with nothing. Lannister. Chapter 68. Angst and Anger 2. Cersei Pav. While she clutched a rag to her forehead though, she had smiled for hours. She had been right about Callum. Even the most devout could see it. And that meant she was right about herself too. If Callum was blessed by the maiden and the crone, perhaps she was blessed by the warrior and the father. Surely the seven wouldn't just bless her brother and leave her with nothing. What was it like to be blessed that way? She wondered. The raven had said that Callum had been held up in front of the entire Starry Sept. Perhaps her father would let her practice with swords if she could just convince the High Septon to do the same for her in the Great Sept of Baelor. Alas, Cersei, like a prisoner, was confined to the Red Keep. Never free to walk the city, never free to use her own mind or even the strength of her arm. Trapped like a golden bird within a crimson cage, no, like one of the lions kept within Castle Rock, a great golden cat within an iron frame. Cersei was a lioness who wanted to leave, to prowl across the plains and hunt her own prey. She wanted out of this stupid bedroom, out of this stupid bed. She wanted to go back to the rock, where no one would stop her from crawling through ancient mining tunnels, where she might be able to accompany Uncle Kevin again on hunts. Where she could see Jaime and Callum again. Cersei felt her melancholy fade as she leapt to her feet, spry and able as she'd ever been. She marched to the basin at one side of her forced new bedroom and began to wash her face. The candlelight flickered on her skin as she braided her hair into a ponytail. It made her lips glow red as she smiled into the silvered mirror on the wall, giving a smile she thought looked quite vicious. Yes, she was a Lannister, a lioness with the heart of a king. Like the leader of her pride, she would be glorious and powerful just as soon as she escaped this bitter cage. With a fierce glare at all around her, she burst out of the door of her room and began making her way towards her father's office once again. It wasn't that late, and father rarely stopped working before midnight anyway. The door was guarded by one Sir Loren Farman, but he didn't make to stop her, just giving a curious glance downward as she stood right up in front of her father's door and knocked as loudly as she could. I'm guessing that's Cersei, come in. Her father invited, and Cersei pushed the door wide as she marched inside, all fire and brimstone in her mind. Her father looked tired, reviewing some papers. It was probably the application for a city charter from Stony Sept that he'd been talking about earlier today. Good evening, Cersei. Tywin set the paper down with a sigh. You look as if you have something to say. He stared at her sharply, and Cersei felt a quiver of fear run up her spine. That was right, she wasn't just talking to anyone, she was talking to her father. Her anger felt smothered as goosebumps ran up her spine under his withering stare. It was hard to say what she wanted to say. Cersei felt sweat build on her brow and she felt like she wanted to cry again under that gaze, but though her stomach turned, she didn't let it stop her. She needed to get this out. She needed to get out of here. Father, I wish to return to Castle Rock. Tywin blinked, the danger in his stare falling away. Oh, he said, sounding honestly surprised. And why is that? The danger returned a little, but not as harshly this time. Cersei felt as if she could breathe again, even as her mind raced to find better reasons. Reasons he'd accept at least. I do not like it here in the Red Keep anymore, father, and there is not much point now, is there? Prince Rhaegar will marry Lady Valia and Prince Viserys will be too young to care about me for many years yet. Cersei gulped. Wouldn't it be better for me to return to Castle Rock? To Lannisport? Her father paused for a long moment, before with a tone of consternation, he asked her carefully. Cersei, do you truly not like it at court? The hand of the king sounded more confused than anything. Your mother always spoke very fondly of her days as a bedmaid to Queen Rhaella. She started when she was about your age. Tywin tapped his fingers. I thought you'd been quite enjoying your time here, it's certainly let you meet more girls your own age and status. Cersei blinked at her father owlishly, a blush finding its way to her cheeks as she looked away, mumbling. Father, I am not mother, I don't want the same things. She shifted from one foot to the other. All the girls at court are fools and the point is, I don't enjoy it at all, father. It's all gossip and wasting time. Cersei said, shaking her head. If father was ever going to understand a single word she said, she needed him to understand this. Yes, that is typically what noblewomen enjoy, Tywin replied, frowning, and Cersei could tell her words were not registering. She needed her father to actually understand her. Noi, that's not the point, father. The point is that I'm not a typical noblewoman. I want to go out and accompany you on hunts. I want to do real things. I don't want some old Valyrian crone to teach me embroidery. I want you to teach me how to rule and rule well. I want to learn important things, and to talk about important decisions. Cersei knew her tone was getting louder, but she couldn't stop now. It was all flowing out of her like wine from a broken jug. I want you to listen to me like you listen to Aunt Jenna. Why can't you show me how to be like she is? You don't act like she's a fool, Cersei sniffed, wiping her tears back with her sleeve once again. Father stared at her strangely, it was an expression she'd never seen on his face before, squinting slightly, with his chin pulled tightly up under his pinched lips and his nose creased. Tywin looked at her as if she was some sort of puzzle to be solved. It made Cersei feel a little uncomfortable, but she bore with it. Whatever he said next couldn't possibly be worse than the sinking feeling in her gut as she realized she'd just been screaming at her father, the man who brooked no disrespect. All right, you will return to the rock. I'll make arrangements for a ship to take you in the morning. Cersei blinked, not sure she'd heard him right, then her mouth fell open. He'd actually listened to her. Truly. Tywin sighed and shook his head. Truly. I had no impression that you disliked court especially. He scratched his cheek. If I keep you here you'll probably act out and cause issues. The best answer is to simply send you back to the rock entirely. Tywin said coolly, and Cersei felt the sting of his words, not a bit, for her heart was thrilling with joy. If you wish to be like Jenna then I'll put you in her care. I've always thought she only ended up the way she is because Sir Emmon is a fool, but she may be able to pass some manner of practical understanding to you nonetheless. Cersei's grin shone on her face like the sun as she rushed around her father's desk to his side, throwing her arms around him. Thank you, father. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She felt Tywin stiffen at her embrace, and she realized with a bit of fear that she did not think she had actually hugged him this way in years. Then his hand came down on the top of her head, patting her gently, and everything was right in Cersei's world. Lannister. Chapter 69. Castle of Artists. Pella Bicade Pav. Pella Bicade watched as the men went about their work, her gaze fixed on the mountainside as all else in the world faded away. Her hazel eyes reflected the vibrant reds of the stone, glistening in the morning light, the deep ochre hues of the wooden rails, the slick gray-black of the whale skins being dragged off of the chains, Reverently her brush daubed another touch of paint on the canvas, mindful of the shade that splashed over the lion's mouth in the early morning sunlight. Carefully she worked the brush along a ridge, then plunged, as if she was walking it herself. Gently she daubed a different brush to capture a passing cloud. Pella was in heaven. Or the heavens, perhaps, if the gods of the Westerosi now held her soul. She didn't especially care which gods got her in the end, as long as they did not interrupt her work. Feverishly she painted the scene, every detail, every vibrant feeling flowing from her mind to her hand. A moment of rhapsody an hour long. When she finished, panting and exhausted, despite not having left her seat, she looked at the painting and grinned. It was good work, some of her best at least for such a short session, and she couldn't stop smiling as she took it inside to dry. Pella checked the angle of the sun and realized with a sudden shock she was late. Scrambling about she tore off her apron and checked over her blue dress to make sure no paint splatters were visible, then pulled a clean apron right back on over it and hurried out of her room. Rushing down the hallway past Nolo, who was tuning his harp, she hurried down 3 flights of stairs, so many stairs, and down the long corridors of the rock, arriving at the door to the workshop some few minutes later. Ah, Pella, come in. Her patron's voice greeted her as she stepped inside. Come tell me what you think about this one. Callum Lannister stood before a canvas with a grid drawn across it, one of dozens that sat to one side of the room. Each covered some aspect of the enormous statue that the boy wanted to build, a marvel to rival the Titan of Bravos. And she was to be its sculptor. Pella was thrilled every time she thought of it. A wonder of the world to be crafted by her fingers. Let me see, she rushed to the golden-haired child's side, looking over the design, as she had many others. Pella was obsessed. This had to be perfect, had to be wondrous. For 1,000 years men and women from across the world might look at the work of her hand and remember her name. Every inch had to be correct. That was why, though the bronze foundry was ready, though the ironworkers had already begun to spit out their cast iron columns for her skeleton, Pella hadn't yet settled on a final design. This is, all right, but the spear is still too thick. She said quietly, looking at it. It needs to be narrower, sleeker still. It needs to be maintainable. Callum Lannister threw back. Men must be able to climb up and fix the arc lamps at the top of it, to replace the filaments, and it must be wide enough to fit a gear shaft so the whole array can spin. It's too fat, we should just put a torch in her other hand. That won't be as stable, we couldn't anchor it to the ground. Pella grinned even as she argued back and forth with Callum Lannister, her juvenile patron. They could do this for hours over every little detail, and had been doing it for days now, exhaustively. Every tweak in the statue's pose. Every thread of golden hair on her head. She argued every day with Callum Lannister, trying to find her perfect artistic vision, and every day he argued back, taking no offense at her words, but fighting her on practicality, in cost, and on what his father would accept. Her initial idea to have the statue be bare-breasted had sadly been thrown out on those grounds. She loved every moment of it. Coming to Westeros had been the best decision in her life. The life of an artist in Pentos was one of boredom and near starvation. Miserly patrons cared for little more than matching the passing trends and fads amongst their fellow magisters. Not one of them cared for art for the beauty of it, only that they could use it to lord over their friends at parties. A rising star and a pioneer of artistic vision one day could see his life, his works, and his scant payment tossed to the garbage pile the next. It was the sort of world where life was a gamble and one that nearly every artist lost. Thus it was that when agents of the Prince of Dorne had come looking for artisans, sculptors, and painters, Pella had leapt onto that gamble also. The demand to convert to the faith of the Seven had not put her off, as it did others. What had the gods of Pentos ever done for her that she should be loyal? And across the sea, she had found something far better than any magister in Pentos. She had found a patron who was himself an artist. Oh, at first she hadn't been so eager to work for a child, but a steady retainer of 1 gold dragon a month, backed by House Lannister's coin. That was enough to sway her on the subject. Everyone knew that House Lannister was richer than anyone, that their Lord Tywin ate lead and shat gold. Besides, at the very least the faithful boy who had hired her and overseen her conversion was far preferable to some fat-fingered rich old lout who would fondle her while she painted, leaving greasy smears on her skin. She has worked for enough of that sort before. No, if anything the girly boy was positively chaste, though that might be due to his youth. He did not even bother the, admittedly much prettier, seamstress from Lee. It was actually somewhat believable when that old high priest had gone on about the boy being blessed by the Westerosi gods, or God, as she had learned. 7 gods in one. The Westerns were strange folk. Hoisted up in the air and proclaimed to be blessed in the midst of that gorgeous, if somewhat small, temple, it was a remarkably striking sight. Pella should know, she'd painted it 4 times since then. But the true wonder happened when they arrived back in Castle Rock. That was when the boy had revealed himself to be an artist. She had seen it in his eyes, first when he bottled lightning. Those emerald orbs reflected the same joy of creation that blazed in Pella's heart. Soon enough it became clear to her that he was an artist just like her. One who painted with money and men and the thundering of smiths' hammers. She saw as he ordered the raising of the new academy that was being built in Lannister, she watched as he built himself new tools just to survey the mountainside for his great lift, and she spoke to him every day as they worked together on the design of the statue of his mother. Yes, Pella had done the most wondrous thing. She had found a patron who was also an artist, one just as passionate for his creation as she was, and one who was willing to use the truly enormous wealth of his family to make it happen. Wait, I think we're thinking about this wrong. Callum brought her back to reality as he stared at the canvas, talking. What if instead of having the maintainer access it from the inside of the spear like this, he scratched out the design that he had been drawing and started sketching next to it? We only widen the top large enough for the mechanism to be accessed and maintained from inside. Like a cup around the light housing, then we can just, he scratched a few marks into the side of the spear. Run a ladder up to it from the arm. It's still large enough to run the wiring and the drive shaft through the, no, it needs to be internal. Callum grumbled, rubbing out the drawing he'd just made. I forgot, the weather here in winter is too bad to have men crawling along the outside. It would be like being on the topmast of a ship during a storm, only 30 times higher up. Pella nodded wisely. She'd been told of how dreadful Westerosi winters could be when she was a girl, though as she understood they were much worse in the north part of the continent than they would be here. Either way, she wasn't looking forward to them. Maybe a torch mounted at the head of the spear then. It could thicken above her hand. Wouldn't that be more of a staff then? Maybe if she leaned on it with both hands like, he drew out a stick figure. No, that would miss that she's bringing light to the world. Pella shook her head, drawing out her own design. Lannister. Chapter 70, Drudgery. Pella bikade Pav. Wouldn't that be more of a staff then? Maybe if she leaned on it with both hands like, he drew out a stick figure. No, that would miss that she's bringing light to the world. Pella shook her head, drawing out her own design. It went on like that for most of the morning, the two of them simply bouncing ideas back and forth off of each other. None of her fellow artisans intervened, as they were all tasked elsewhere. Artists all of them, just like her. That dark-skinned Molo was at the dockyard in the base of the castle as usual, learning the Westerosi methods of building ships to complement his own knowledge. Burrick was still copying down his star charts for Maester Eomund, and Hashel had taken to Lord Callum's electrical sorceries. She supposed that made sense since the man was Carthene. He was making glazed clay casings for the boy's strange batteries. Nolo was busy, doing whatever it was Callum had him doing, she really didn't know, and the less she knew about what Qyburn was doing the better. The old man was supposedly one of the most learned healers in the world, which was saying something. Westerosi maesters were famously good healers, but whenever he spoke she got the impression that he was an artist like her, only the human body was his art. That always got her guts turning. Supposedly Callum had him writing a book of medicine, but Pella wanted absolutely nothing to do with something that old freak created. Malek and Loam contributed to the statue project in their own ways. Malek was overseeing the ironworks nearly 2,000 feet below them. The men of Nugis were not so good at blacksmithing as the Kohori, but their iron legions all wore the same armor and held the same weapons made by rote in the same manner over and over again. For Callum, who wanted cast iron pillars made to precise specifications as the statue's skeleton, there was no better man to oversee their creation. Loam meanwhile was charged with making the great glass panels that would surround the arc lights in the statue's torch. She didn't fully understand the process, but supposedly the glass was being cast in flat iron tables much as the cast iron was being made next door. And indeed, as the very statue she was going to sculpt would be cast in bronze. Mela was also contributing to the statue as well, she supposed, making a pair of identical dresses. One would be worn by Callum himself, and the other by his lady Jenna Lannister when the time came for her to sculpt the first model of the statue. Since Callum would be providing the face of the statue, as well as the neck, shoulders, and upper back, while his aunt would be providing the rest of the body. It was the first time that Pella had heard of such a thing, but she supposed most statues were built to represent still living people. It was rather hard to represent a dead woman correctly, especially with Westerosi standards of portrait painting. The plan, such as it stood, was to carve out a life-sized clay sculpture first, then cut it into pieces, recreate those pieces on a larger scale, about 20 feet high, and cast that into a bronze statue. Once that was cast, they could then go on to start casting the skin of the final statue. Of course, the iron skeleton of the former Lady of Castle Rock would go into place long before her skin was completed. In fact, that part might actually be complete before the year was out. The skin meanwhile would be cast from bronze in sections, then covered on the outside with gold leaf. As the skin was affixed to the skeleton by copper bolts, shielded from the iron by a mixture of various powders she didn't know the name for, a thick but transparent lacquer would be applied over the top of the gold leaf very carefully. Pella hoped which would then harden into a coating over the entire statue, protecting the thin gold wrapping from the elements and keeping the rain and wind out of its guts. There were other parts, beyond the actual structure and manner in which the thing was going to hold a spear and torch, that Pella didn't quite understand. Something about the way the frame was built letting the statue move and shift in the wind slightly while still being rigid. Callum had told her how it worked, but it wasn't really her focus. She glanced down at the boy next to her, continuing to rattle off ideas of how exactly they could get it to look good while preserving all the desired functionality. The sunlight cutting in through the windows of the workshop, which looked out over Lannister like most of the ones in the rock, glinted off and shimmered in his blonde hair. Well, that was something she'd need to paint later. Cersei Lannister Pav. She had left for Castle Rock ahead of Prince Rhaegar's wedding. The streets had already been filled with colorful banners, and packed with mummers and courtiers and visiting nobles and prostitutes. The whole length of the avenue between the Great Sept of Baelor and Aegon's High Hill had been repainted and cleaned of trash and sewage, and the whole city was primed for celebration. When the cog that was to take her back to Lannisport, the Blue Emerald left port at midday, there were many ships arriving, but only one leaving, with her aboard it. It felt strange, hollow. She did want to leave King's Landing, that was for certain, but she also didn't want to leave Things Halfdan. The sorceress witch was still going to marry Prince Rhaegar, to be Queen of the Seven Kingdoms someday. Fleeing her wedding tasted like defeat, and it was not a taste Cersei liked much at all. As when she had lost access to the tunnels though, there was not much Cersei could do about it, so, deciding that moping about in her cabin was not satisfying, she spent much of her time up on the deck of the Emerald, taking in the south coast of the Blackwater Bay as it passed by. Most of it, truth be told, was a small beach leading up to the Kingswood, the great forest of the Crownlands. Here and there the woods would give way to small fishing villages and lumber camps that clung to the forest's edge, shipping their goods by small boats across the bay to King's Landing, which had a fierce desire for fish and firewood both. Cersei did not speak much to anyone else on the ship during the first leg of the voyage, which took them past Tarth and around the edge of Shipbreaker Bay. She took her breakfast alone in her cabin, guarded by the knight her father had sent with her, and she sat on the deck and watched the coastline. Cersei grew bored. She grew bored very quickly. By the third day, she was on the verge of pulling her hair out. She began to pester Sir Oswald about the sights on the coast, about the means of sailing, about the winds, the clouds, anything, but the man was a dullard. She was practically alone, without any intelligent company, trapped here until the ship made port at Aldtown to resupply. Didn't Callum make this trip? Cersei wondered on the fifth day, tugging at her hair as they passed Tarth and began to sail towards Cape Wrath. How did he avoid this hideous boredom? She frowned, then sighed. He probably just wrote books. Scratching her cheek, Cersei glanced around and grimaced. The sailors all gave her a wide berth, as they should, but that meant basically the only person to talk to was Sir Oswald, who was no fun at all. There was absolutely nothing to do on a boat, aside from watching the coast or sitting in your cabin doing nothing. It was an endless drudgery that was driving her slowly insane. Not as bad as embroidering groups, but terrible nonetheless. It was another 2 days to cross the Sea of Dorne and the Stepstones, by which point Cersei was nearly pulling her hair out in raw boredom. She'd even thought to try writing, as she was sure Callum must have done, but she soon realized that she'd only brought enough paper and ink with her to write a couple of letters. It would at best entertain her for a few hours, so she set it aside and laid on her bed like a sponge, hoping that maybe if she slept through the whole trip it would be over faster. She barely lasted an hour before she was up on deck again. She simply couldn't get to sleep at midday, tossing and turning on her bed and stewing in her dissatisfaction with this trip, with Jaime being sent away to the Reach where she'd never see him, with the fact that the Volantine witch was still going to marry Rhaegar. Were all the good men around her going to be stolen away and she left to marry some knight's son like a lesser woman? To Cersei's mind, it seemed all too plausible. First, the Dornish princess had bullied poor Callum, belittling and insulting the soft boy. Then Jaime was sent off to marry a Tyrell girl from the Reach, and now even Rhaegar, who Cersei was supposed to marry, was stolen away by some snake from Essos. It made her want to cry, but she would not because she was too strong, so instead she prowled up onto the deck and watched the land pass by because it was all she could do. Equals 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 equals. If you'd like to support my work, or get early access to chapters before public release, you can join my Patreon. Link to join my Patreon. Patreon. Com. Moonlight 10.